One choice. One moment. One love story. Welcome to When He Chose Her. Enjoy the story. You can stay, but I don't have space for pride, she said quietly, as the rain traced cold lines down the glass behind him. Ethan Caldwell had stood in boardrooms that overlooked Manhattan, had signed deals worth more than most people would see in a lifetime, had once believed doors only opened for him, never against him. But tonight, he stood outside one that almost didn't. The hallway smelled faintly of old wood and coffee grounds, the kind of place no one with his name would have noticed before. And yet here he was, suit soaked through, leather shoes dulled by water, hair no longer perfectly set, but falling slightly out of place like something in him had finally given up pretending. 24 hours earlier, he had been at the head of a long polished table, a Swiss watch ticking softly against his wrist as voices rose around him, controlled at first, then sharper, colder, each word another quiet cut, until the final one landed without emotion. "We're voting you out." No one raised their voice. No one needed to. Power, he realized too late, didn't disappear in chaos. It disappeared in silence. He remembered the way his hand had hovered just slightly above the table, not shaking, not quite steady either, as if his body understood before his mind did that something irreversible had already happened. By midnight, his access was gone. By morning, his accounts were frozen. By afternoon, the penthouse he owned had a new lock code he didn't recognize. He had stood there for a long moment, keycard useless in his hand, staring at a door that had once opened before he even reached for it. The doorman avoided his eyes. The assistant didn't answer. His phone, once an extension of his authority, stayed silent. And now, hours later, he found himself here, in front of Clara Whitmore's door, not entirely sure what had brought him back to the only place that had ever looked at him without expectation. She had recognized him, of course, not by his name, not by headlines, but by the way he carried himself even when everything else had fallen away. She had seen him before the suits, before the titles, in the brief pauses between orders when he sat alone at the corner table, always checking his phone, always somewhere else. And now she saw him again, without any of it. Clara stepped aside without making a moment of it, as if inviting a billionaire into a one-bedroom walk-up was the most ordinary thing in the world. Inside, the apartment was small, maybe 400 square feet, but it was precise, intentional. A narrow couch, a clean wooden table, a single lamp casting warm light that softened everything the rain outside tried to harden. There was no clutter, only what mattered. Ethan hesitated just past the doorway, water dripping quietly onto the floor, aware for the first time in years that he didn't belong in a space because of what he owned, but because someone allowed him to be there. "Bathrooms down the hall," Clara said, already turning back toward the kitchenette, her voice steady, unhurried. No curiosity, no pity, just direction. He opened his mouth, perhaps to explain, perhaps to reassert something that no longer existed, but the words didn't come. Instead, he nodded once, almost to himself, and moved as told. The mirror in the bathroom was small, slightly worn at the edges, but clear enough to show him what the world now saw. Not a CEO, not a billionaire, just a man in a damp suit, eyes a little more tired than he remembered. When he stepped back out, she handed him a towel without looking directly at him, placing it in his hands like it was simply the next logical step, like dignity could be given quietly, without making it a spectacle. "You can take the couch," she added, then paused just long enough to glance at him, a hint of something almost amused in her eyes. "And don't worry, it humbles everyone the first night." For a second, something unfamiliar flickered across his face. Not anger, not pride, something closer to recognition. Outside, the storm kept moving, loud and relentless, but inside that small apartment, for the first time since everything had fallen apart, Ethan Caldwell wasn't trying to control anything. He was just standing there, holding a towel in a place where no one expected anything from him. And somehow, that felt heavier than losing everything else. The couch was narrower than it had looked from across the room, and far less forgiving than anything Ethan Caldwell had ever rested on before, but he did not complain, not out loud, not even to himself, as he lowered onto it with a stiffness that had nothing to do with the furniture and everything to do with the quiet realization settling in his chest. The city outside continued its endless rhythm, tires hissing on wet pavement, distant horns echoing between buildings, but inside Clara Whitmore's apartment, the sound was softened, filtered, almost distant, like a life he had once controlled and now could only observe from the outside. He adjusted the thin pillow once, then again, as if the right angle might restore some sense of order, but the discomfort remained, persistent, honest, impossible to negotiate with. From the kitchenette, he could hear the faint clink of ceramic, the measured movement of someone who did not rush even when there was no one watching, and that alone unsettled him more than the silence. Most people filled silence with noise, with explanations, with questions, but Clara did not. She moved through it as if it belonged to her. He sat up slightly, glancing toward the small table where a single mug rested beside a stack of papers, each page aligned with quiet precision, numbers written in neat columns that caught his attention before he could stop himself. Financial figures, projections, notes in the margins, not careless, not amateur, but deliberate, informed. He looked away quickly, as if he had seen something he was not supposed to, something that did not match the version of her he had already decided on. "It is just coffee," she said, her voice calm as she set the mug down in front of him, not asking if he wanted it, simply placing it there like a fact. He hesitated, then took it, the warmth immediate against his hands, grounding in a way he did not expect. "You always assume people need permission for simple things," she added, not unkindly, but with a quiet edge that made him pause. He let out a breath he had not realized he was holding, a small sound, almost a laugh, though it carried no humor. "I am used to controlling variables," he said, the words automatic, practiced, but they felt different here, lighter, almost hollow. Clara leaned against the counter, arms folded loosely, watching him not with curiosity, but with something closer to assessment, as if she were measuring not who he had been, but who he was now. "And how is that working tonight?" she asked, a simple question, delivered without pressure. He looked down at the coffee, watching the faint ripple across its surface, and, for a moment, there was no answer he could give that would not sound like a lie. "Not very well," he admitted finally, the words quieter than he intended. She nodded once, as if confirming something she already knew, then turned back to rinse the kettle, the conversation ending without ceremony. He sat there, the mug warming his hands, the room holding a kind of stillness he had never allowed himself to notice before, and slowly, something shifted, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough that he stopped trying to fix it. Later, when the lights dimmed and the apartment settled into a softer quiet, he lay back on the couch again, staring at the ceiling, tracing the faint lines where paint met shadow, his mind drifting not to strategies or numbers, but to moments, small ones. The way Clara had handed him the towel without looking at him, the way she had spoken without hesitation, without deference. It was unfamiliar, but not uncomfortable, not in the way he expected. Across the room, a soft glow from the laptop illuminated her face as she worked, fingers moving steadily across the keyboard, pausing only to adjust a figure, to reconsider, to refine. He watched for a moment longer than he should have, noticing the focus, the discipline, the quiet confidence that did not need to announce itself. Then he closed his eyes, not because he was tired, but because for the first time in years, there was nothing he could do to change what tomorrow would bring, and strangely, that felt less like a loss and more like something he had forgotten how to live without. Morning did not arrive gently. It slipped in through the thin curtains in quiet shades of gray, the kind of light that did not ask permission but did not demand attention either. And Ethan Caldwell woke before the alarm on Clara Whitmore's phone ever had a chance to sound. His body unfamiliar with the firmness of the couch, his shoulders stiff, his neck protesting in small, honest ways he could not ignore. For a moment, he did not move, staring at the ceiling again, trying to remember where he was without reaching for the reflex that had always defined him, the urge to check messages, to confirm control, to regain direction. But there was no phone vibrating beside him, no assistant waiting, no schedule dictating the next step, only the soft hum of a city already awake and the faint sound of movement from the kitchenette. Clara was already there, standing by the stove, her hair loosely tied back, sleeves rolled just enough to keep them clear as she stirred something simple in a small pan, the scent of coffee rising again, steady and familiar. grounding in a way he had not expected to need. She did not turn when she sensed him sitting up, did not greet him with questions or concern, only spoke as if continuing a conversation that had never required words. "There is toast if you want it." Her voice even, measured, as she placed a plate on the counter without looking at him. Ethan pushed himself up slowly, adjusting his jacket, which had dried overnight, but still carried the faint creases of yesterday's fall, and walked toward the counter with a hesitation that would have been invisible to anyone who did not know him before. He reached for the plate, paused, then glanced toward her. "You do this every morning?" he asked, not because he needed the answer, but because silence no longer felt as natural as it had the night before. Clara gave a small shrug, setting the pan aside. "I eat every morning," she replied, as if that explained everything, as if routine was not something to be questioned but simply lived. He almost smiled, not fully, just enough for the expression to exist for a second before it disappeared, replaced by something more thoughtful. He took a bite, the toast simple, unremarkable, and yet he ate it slower than he would have eaten a meal prepared by a private chef, not out of preference, but because there was nothing else competing for his attention. After a moment, his eyes drifted again to the table, to the same stack of papers he had noticed the night before, now slightly rearranged, updated, as if work had continued long after he had closed his eyes. He stepped closer, careful not to intrude, but unable to ignore the pattern, the structure, the unmistakable logic in the numbers. "You track markets?" he asked, his tone quieter, more curious than it had been in years. Clara glanced over briefly, then back to her mug. "I track what matters," she said, taking a sip, leaving the statement open, unfinished, but complete in its own way. Ethan leaned slightly, scanning a line, then another, recognizing projections that aligned too precisely with shifts he knew had not yet been publicly acknowledged, insights that required not just knowledge, but instinct. He straightened, something sharper now in his gaze. "This is not casual," he said, more to himself than to her. A faint seal caught his eye, Columbia Business School, nearly erased, like it was never meant to be seen. Clara met his eyes for a brief second, then looked away, not dismissing him, but not inviting further questions either. "Neither is losing everything overnight," she replied softly, the words landing without accusation, without sympathy, simply as fact. The room held that silence again, but it felt different now, less empty, more intentional, as if both of them understood something unspoken had just been acknowledged. Ethan nodded once, slowly, not in agreement, but in recognition. And for the first time since he had stepped into that apartment, he stopped seeing Clara Whitmore as someone who had offered him shelter and began to see her as someone who had chosen it, deliberately, with a clarity he was only beginning to understand. Outside, the city continued without pause, people moving, deals being made, decisions unfolding without him. But inside that small apartment, something quieter was shifting, something that did not require a boardroom or a title, something that could not be taken away with a vote. And as he set the empty plate down and reached for the coffee again, Ethan Caldwell realized that the first decision he had made since losing everything was not about reclaiming power, but about staying exactly where he was, at least for now, because for reasons he could not yet explain, it felt like the only place where the truth was not hidden behind anything at all. By late morning, the apartment felt smaller, not because of its size, but because Ethan Caldwell had nowhere to go. And for a man who had spent his life moving between glass towers, private cars, and carefully controlled spaces, stillness began to feel like something he had to learn rather than escape. Clara Whitmore, on the other hand, moved through it with quiet efficiency, finishing her coffee, checking the time on the simple clock above the sink, and gathering her things without hesitation. Her routine unaffected by the presence of someone who, in another life, would have disrupted everything. "I have a shift," she said, slipping her worn jacket over her shoulders, her tone neutral, not apologizing, not explaining, just stating a fact. Ethan nodded, though the gesture felt unnecessary, and watched as she picked up her bag, pausing briefly by the table to adjust the stack of papers, aligning the edges with a precision that caught his attention again. "You can stay," she added, glancing toward him for only a second. "Just lock the door when you leave." And with that, she was gone, the door closing softly behind her, leaving the apartment quieter than before. He stood there for a moment, listening to the fading echo of her footsteps in the hallway, then turned slowly back toward the room, the stillness now entirely his. He walked toward the window, looking down at the street below, people moving with purpose, cars passing in steady lines, the city continuing without pause, without him, and for the first time, he did not feel the immediate need to rejoin it. Instead, he turned back, his eyes drawn once more to the table, to the papers he had only glanced at before. He hesitated, then stepped closer, not out of curiosity alone, but something more focused, something familiar beginning to return. The numbers were clean, structured, layered with insight that went beyond surface analysis, and as he read, line by line, he felt that sharp awareness settle back into place. The part of him that had built everything he lost, the part that recognized patterns others missed. This was not casual observation. This was strategy, disciplined, informed, and quietly brilliant. He leaned in slightly, tracing a column with his eyes, then another, noticing projections tied to sectors he knew were about to shift, movements not yet public, decisions still forming behind closed doors. He straightened slowly, his expression changing, not into the controlled confidence he once wore, but into something more genuine, something closer to surprise. "Who are you?" he murmured, though the question was not meant to be answered. The room held its silence, offering nothing back, and yet it felt like it had already said enough. He moved away from the table, pacing once across the small space. Then again, the motion instinctive, as if his mind required movement to process what it had just seen. This was not coincidence, and it was not luck. It was knowledge earned somewhere, sometime, in a world she had chosen not to talk about. He stopped by the counter, resting his hands lightly against the surface, the cool wood grounding him as another realization surfaced, slower, heavier. She had seen him at his lowest point and had not reacted, had not adjusted her behavior to match what he used to be, and now he was seeing her in a way that did not fit the role she played. The balance had shifted, quietly, without announcement. Hours passed without him noticing, the light changing gradually as the day moved forward, and when he finally checked the time, it felt less like tracking a schedule and more like discovering something he had lost. He stepped outside briefly, the air cooler now, the streets busier, and for a moment, he considered reaching out, making calls, pushing back into the world that had removed him so efficiently, but his hand did not move toward his pocket, his phone still silent, still irrelevant. Instead, he walked a short distance, observing, listening, blending into a rhythm he had never needed to understand before. When he returned to the apartment later that afternoon, he closed the door behind him with more care than necessary, as if the space itself required respect, and sat down at the small table, not to take control, not to fix anything, but to think. The numbers on Clara's pages remained exactly as he had left them, but they no longer felt like something he needed to solve. They felt like something he needed to understand. And as the light dimmed again and the city began its slow transition into evening, Ethan Caldwell realized that for the first time in years, he was not trying to win anything. He was trying to learn, and the difference, though subtle, changed everything about the way he sat there, quietly, in a room that had never been designed for someone like him, yet somehow fit him better than any place he had ever owned. Clara Whitmore returned just after sunset, the hallway light flickering once before settling as she pushed the door open with her shoulder, balancing a small paper bag in one hand and her keys in the other, her movements as steady as they had been that morning, unchanged by the hours she had spent away. Ethan Caldwell was still at the table, though the position had shifted, the papers now spread slightly wider, not disturbed carelessly, but studied, understood, and then carefully placed back in order, his posture less rigid than before, but more focused, as if something inside him had quietly reassembled without announcement. She paused for a fraction of a second when she saw him there, not surprised, not impressed, just aware, and stepped inside, closing the door behind her with the same soft precision. "You did not leave," she said, setting the bag down on the counter, her tone neutral, but not questioning. Ethan leaned back slightly, his hands resting on the edge of the table. "I was not sure where to go," he replied, the honesty in his voice simple, unguarded. Clara nodded once, as if that answer required no further explanation, and began unpacking the bag, placing out two small containers, one with something warm, the other with something wrapped in foil. "Dinner," she said, glancing toward him briefly. Nothing impressive, and yet she placed it on the table as if it mattered. He stood, moving closer, watching as she opened the containers, the smell of something simple but comforting filling the room, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Ethan reached toward the papers, tapping lightly on the top page. "These projections," he began, his tone measured, careful not to overstep. "They are based on data that has not been released yet." Clara did not look up immediately, instead setting down a fork, aligning it with quiet precision before answering. "Information moves before it is announced," she said, finally meeting his gaze. "You just have to know where to listen." There was no challenge in her voice, no attempt to impress, only a statement, and that unsettled him more than if she had tried. He studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "You could be in any firm in the city," he said, not as a compliment, but as a fact. "You would outperform most of them." Clara gave a small shrug, sitting down across from him. "And yet, I am here," she replied, picking up her fork, her tone neither defensive nor regretful. Ethan sat as well, the two of them now facing each other across the small table, the distance between them no more than a few feet, but filled with something neither of them named. They began to eat, quietly at first, the clink of utensils the only sound, but the silence no longer felt empty, it felt shared. After a moment, Clara spoke again, her voice softer, but deliberate. "You are not used to this," she said, not asking. Ethan let out a breath that almost resembled a laugh. "No," he admitted, glancing down at the plate, then back at her. "I am used to people telling me what I want to hear." Clara tilted her head slightly, studying him with that same calm attention. "And now?" she asked. He paused, considering the question longer than necessary, then answered, "Now I am not sure what I want to hear." The honesty lingered in the air, heavier than anything else he had said. Clara nodded once, as if that was enough, and returned to her meal. Time passed in small, unnoticed increments, the kind that did not demand attention but reshaped the room anyway. And as they finished eating, Ethan found himself doing something unfamiliar. He stood, gathered the empty containers, and moved toward the sink without being asked. Clara watched for a moment, a faint hint of amusement crossing her expression. "Careful," she said lightly. "Those are not designed for boardroom negotiations." He glanced back at her, a small, genuine smile appearing for the first time, brief but unmistakable. "I will try not to overcomplicate it," he replied, turning back to the sink. The water ran, steady and warm, and, for a moment, the simplicity of the action felt more grounding than any decision he had ever made. When he finished, he dried his hands slowly, then turned, leaning lightly against the counter, his gaze finding her again. "You knew who I was," he said, not as an accusation, but as a realization. Clara met his eyes without hesitation. "Yes," she answered, just as simply. He nodded once, absorbing it, then asked, "And you still opened the door?" She held his gaze for a second longer, then looked away, her voice quieter now, but steady. "You looked like someone who needed one." The words settled between them, not dramatic, not heavy, but true in a way that did not need emphasis. Outside, the city lights flickered to life, one by one, the world continuing its pace, its noise, its endless movement. But inside that small apartment, something else was happening, something quieter, something neither of them could measure or predict. And as Ethan Caldwell stood there, no longer defined by what he had lost, and Clara Whitmore sat across from him, unchanged by what she could have gained, the space between them felt less like a difference and more like a beginning neither of them had planned, but neither of them seemed ready to walk away from. The next morning arrived with clearer light, the kind that revealed more than it softened, and Ethan Caldwell was already awake, sitting at the small table with Clara Whitmore's notes spread out again. But this time he was not just observing. He was working, a pen in his hand, his movements precise, controlled, almost instinctive, as if the part of him that had been forced into silence was finally finding its voice again. He had added a few lines, small adjustments, nothing overwhelming, just subtle shifts in timing, in allocation, in risk, the kind of refinements that did not scream for attention but changed outcomes quietly. When Clara stepped out of the hallway, tying her hair back as she walked, she stopped mid-step, her eyes moving from him to the papers, then back again, her expression unreadable for a moment. "You moved my numbers," she said, not accusing, just stating what was already clear. Ethan did not look up. Immediately, finishing the line he was working on before setting the pen down, then meeting her gaze with a calm he had not carried in days. "I adjusted them," he replied, his tone measured, not defensive. "Your timing on the energy sector is early by about 3 weeks, but if you shift the entry point, the return stabilizes." Clara stepped closer, her attention now fully on the page, scanning quickly, her eyes moving with familiarity, with understanding, and then she paused, just for a second, the smallest break in her rhythm. "You are assuming policy confirmation before announcement," she said quietly, almost to herself. Ethan nodded once. "It already happened, just not publicly," he answered, and there it was, the recognition, not spoken, but visible. The moment where two perspectives met and neither dismissed the other. Clara straightened slightly, her arms folding loosely, not defensive, but thoughtful. "You should not be here," she said after a moment, her voice calm, but carrying something deeper beneath it. Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair, studying her expression. "I could say the same to you," he replied, not as a challenge, but as a mirror. The room held that silence again, but it was different now. Sharper, more aware, as if something between them had shifted into focus. Clara walked past him, reaching for her mug, pouring coffee with steady hands, then turning back, leaning lightly against the counter. "I left that world for a reason," she said, her voice softer now, but not uncertain. Her hand paused over the paper, just for a second, then it moved again, steady. Ethan nodded slowly. "And I lost mine for one," he answered, the honesty landing without weight. "Just fact." Clara looked at him for a long moment, then back at the papers, her gaze lingering on the changes he had made, and something in her expression softened, not into approval, but into acknowledgement. "You did not overcorrect," she said, almost as if she were surprised by that. Ethan allowed a faint smile, brief but real. "I am learning," he replied. She exhaled quietly, a sound that carried more meaning than words, then set her mug down and walked back to the table, pulling out the chair across from him and sitting down, not as a host, not as a guest, but as someone meeting him on equal ground. "If you are going to change my work," she said, her tone steady, "then you explain it." Ethan nodded once, leaning forward slightly, the space between them now filled with something different, something closer to collaboration than coincidence. He began to speak, not in the commanding tone he once used in boardrooms, but in a quieter, more deliberate way, breaking down the reasoning, the timing, the connections, and Clara listened, not interrupting, not dismissing, her focus sharp, her questions precise when they came. Time moved without either of them noticing, the light shifting again, the city outside continuing its endless motion, but inside that small apartment, two minds worked side by side, not competing, not proving, just building something that had no name yet. At one point, Clara leaned back slightly, studying him with a look that carried both curiosity and something else, something less defined. "You are different here," she said, the observation simple, but direct. Ethan paused, considering the words, then glanced around the room, the small table, the imperfect walls, the quiet that did not demand anything from him. "There is nothing here to perform for," he replied, and the truth of it settled between them without resistance. Clara held his gaze for a moment longer, then gave a small nod, as if that answer was enough. Outside, a car passed, the sound fading quickly, and inside, the silence returned, but it no longer felt like emptiness. It felt like space, space for something to grow, something neither of them had planned, but neither of them seemed willing to interrupt. And as Ethan Caldwell reached for the pen again, this time not to take over, but to continue alongside her, Clara Whitmore did not stop him, and that, more than anything else, marked the moment where this was no longer just an act of kindness, but the beginning of something neither of them could fully control, and for the first time, neither of them seemed to want to. The afternoon stretched longer than either of them expected, not because of time itself, but because something inside that small apartment had begun to shift into rhythm, a quiet alignment that did not require effort, only attention. Ethan Caldwell sat across from Clara Whitmore, both of them leaning over the table now, the papers no longer separated into hers and his, but layered together, revised, refined, rewritten in places where one insight met another and became something stronger. The air felt different, not tense, not light, but focused, the kind of stillness that existed when two people stopped proving and started understanding. Clara tapped the edge of a page lightly, her finger pausing over a section he had adjusted earlier. "If this holds," she said, her voice low, almost thoughtful, "then the rebound does not just stabilize, it accelerates." Ethan nodded, his eyes already tracing the implications beyond the line itself. "Only if the confidence returns," he added, his tone steady. "And confidence does not follow numbers, it follows perception." Clara looked up at him then, really looked, as if weighing something beyond the conversation, something that had nothing to do with markets or projections. "You are not thinking about this as theory," she said quietly. Ethan leaned back slightly, exhaling in a way that carried more weight than the words that followed. "It is not theory," he answered, and for a moment, the room shifted again, the work between them, revealing something deeper. Clara's expression changed, not dramatically, but enough to signal that she understood what he had not yet said out loud. "You have a way back," she said, not as a question, but as a realization. Ethan did not answer immediately, his gaze drifting briefly to the window, to the city that still moved without him, then back to the table, to the work they had built together. "There is an opening," he said finally, the words careful, deliberate. "A group of investors who did not agree with the decision. They are waiting to see if I move." Clara watched him in silence, her posture still, her attention steady. "And if you do?" she asked. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, not in frustration, but in thought. "Then I take back control," he replied, the sentence simple, but carrying everything he had been before. The silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy with understanding, with implication, with choice. Clara leaned back slowly, her arms folding loosely again, her gaze no longer on the papers, but on him. "And what happens to this?" she asked, her tone even, but quieter now. Ethan followed her gaze, looking down at the table, at the pages filled with both of their thoughts, their combined perspective, something that had not existed before this room, before this moment. "It depends," he said, though the answer felt incomplete even as he spoke it. Clara tilted her head slightly, not challenging, not pressing, just waiting. "On what?" she asked. Ethan met her eyes again, and for the first time since the conversation shifted, there was uncertainty there, not weakness, but something more honest. "On whether I can do both," he admitted. Clara held his gaze for a second longer, then looked away, her expression settling into something calm, but distant, as if she had already reached a conclusion he had not. "You cannot," she said softly, not as an opinion, but as a fact she had already accepted. Ethan did not argue, because a part of him knew she was right, knew that the world he came from did not allow space for anything that could not be controlled, and what had begun here could not be controlled, only chosen. The light outside shifted again, fading into early evening, shadows stretching across the floor, and the room grew quieter, not with discomfort, but with awareness. Clara stood after a moment, gathering a few of the papers, stacking them neatly, her movements precise, unchanged, as if the conversation had not unsettled her at all. "If you go back," she said, her voice steady as she aligned the edges, "do not come back halfway." Ethan watched her, something in his chest tightening in a way that had nothing to do with loss of power or position. "And if I do not go back?" he asked, the question quieter than he intended. Clara paused for just a fraction of a second, then continued her movement, setting the stack down carefully. "Then you will have to decide who you are without it," she replied. The words lingered, not heavy, but clear. And for the first time, the decision in front of him felt different, not like a strategy to execute, but like a truth to face. Outside, the city lights flickered on again, one by one, and inside that small apartment, Ethan Caldwell realized that the next move he made would not define his career, It would define him, and Clara Whitmore, standing just a few feet away, had already chosen her answer, whether he understood it yet or not. That night, the apartment did not feel the same, not because anything had physically changed, but because the decision that had been quietly forming between them now had weight, and both of them could feel it without saying a word. Ethan Caldwell stood by the window longer than usual, his reflection faint against the glass, the city lights stretching endlessly beyond him, each one representing a world he once moved through without hesitation, and now watched from a distance. Behind him, Clara Whitmore moved with her usual calm, rinsing a cup, setting it aside, the rhythm of her actions steady, unchanged, but there was a quiet distance in the way she avoided looking directly at him, not out of discomfort, but out of clarity. She already knew something he was still trying to decide. "They will call," she said finally, her voice soft but certain, not turning around. Ethan exhaled slowly, his hands resting against the cool glass. "They already did," he replied, and as if on cue his phone, resting on the table, lit up again, the screen glowing briefly in the dim room. The name of someone who had once waited for his approval, now waiting for his response. Clara did not move toward it, did not glance at it, as if it did not belong in this space. "You should answer," she said, still facing the sink. Ethan turned his head slightly, looking at the phone, then back at her. "And say what?" he asked. She dried her hands carefully before turning, meeting his eyes with the same steady calm. "Say what you always say," she answered. "Take control." There was no bitterness in her voice, only truth. He stepped away from the window, moving toward the table, each step slower than the one before, as if the distance between him and that phone was heavier than it should have been. He picked it up, the weight familiar, the power behind it unchanged, and for a moment, everything felt like it could return to what it was, with one call, one decision, one move. He answered, his voice measured, controlled, the version of himself that had built everything slipping back into place almost effortlessly. "Ethan," the voice on the other end said quickly, urgency clear even through the speaker. "We have an opening. The board is not stable. If you move now, you can take it back, but there is a condition." Ethan's expression did not change, but something in his eyes sharpened. "What condition?" he asked. There was a brief pause. Then the answer came, quiet but direct. "The restructuring proposal includes external advisory assets. One of them is Clara Whitmore. We need her analysis integrated, but under contract, full rights assigned to the firm." Ethan's grip on the phone tightened slightly, not visibly, but enough that he felt it. His eyes shifted, finding Clara across the room, who had gone still, not surprised, not confused, just aware. "You want her work," he said slowly. "We need it," the voice corrected. "And if she signs, everything moves faster, cleaner. This is your way back." The words hung there, simple, logical, exactly the kind of decision he would have made without hesitation before. Ethan looked at Clara, really looked this time, not as someone who had helped him, not as someone connected to an opportunity, but as someone who had chosen to open a door when he had nothing left, someone who had never once asked for anything in return. Clara held his gaze, her expression calm, but there was something deeper beneath it now, something that understood exactly what was being asked without needing to hear the words. "Do what powerful people always do," she said quietly, the same sentence from before, but now it carried something else, not instruction, not expectation, but freedom. Ethan closed his eyes for just a moment, the weight of two worlds pressing against each other, one built on control, on precision, on taking what was necessary to win, and the other built on something far less defined, but far more honest. When he opened them again, the decision was already made. "No," he said into the phone, his voice steady, final. There was silence on the other end, followed by a confused, almost disbelieving response. "No?" Ethan's gaze did not leave Clara. "No deal that takes from someone who never took from me," he replied, and without waiting for a response, he ended the call. The room fell into a different kind of silence, not uncertain, not heavy, but clear, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Clara's eyes searched his face, not for confirmation, but for understanding, and when she found it, something in her expression softened in a way it had not before, not dramatic, not overwhelming, but real, Ethan. Set the phone down slowly, the object that once defined everything now just another thing on the table, and took a step toward her, then another, until the space between them was no longer defined by distance but by choice. I am not going back that way, he said quietly, not as a declaration, but as a truth he had finally accepted. Clara looked at him for a long moment, then gave the smallest nod, as if that was all that needed to be said. Outside, the city continued without pause, deals still happening, decisions still being made. But inside that small apartment, something far more important had just shifted, and for the first time, neither of them looked away. Weeks turned into months quietly. No announcement, no decision, just staying. And somewhere along the way, it stopped feeling temporary. The apartment no longer felt like a place to stay. It felt like something to belong to. Mornings became routine without saying a word. Coffee brewed before conversation. Papers spread across the table, no longer separate ideas, but shared work, refined in a rhythm that needed no explanation. Ethan no longer looked at the city as something he had lost, but as something he could rebuild differently, not from the top down, but from the ground up, one decision at a time. And Clara no longer kept her distance in the same way, her quiet presence now less guarded, her words fewer but more open, as if she had allowed the space between them to change without needing to control it. One afternoon, as sunlight stretched across the table, catching the edges of their notes, Ethan leaned back, slightly, studying the model they had built together, not as a replacement for what he had lost, but as something new, something cleaner, something that did not rely on the same compromises. This works, he said quietly, not with excitement, but with certainty. Clara glanced at the page, then at him, her expression calm but warmer than before. It always did, she replied, and there was no need to clarify whether she meant the numbers or something else entirely. Opportunities had come again, not as demands, but as invitations, investors who had heard of his refusal, who respected it more than they understood it. People willing to back something different, something smaller, something built with intention instead of control. He had taken some of those meetings, carefully, without rushing, without returning to the version of himself that once dominated every room, and each time he returned, he brought the conversation back to the same place, the same table, the same quiet partnership that had started with nothing more than shared insight and an unexpected door left open. Clara had listened, occasionally offering a perspective, occasionally saying nothing at all, but always present in a way that shaped the outcome without needing recognition. One evening, after a long day that had not felt exhausting but meaningful, they sat across from each other again, the city outside glowing with the same endless energy, but no longer pulling at him in the same way. Ethan rested his hands lightly on the table, looking at her not as someone who had helped him, not as someone who had changed his path, but as someone who had become part of it without ever asking to be. They want to formalize it, he said, his voice steady. A new firm, smaller, independent, built on this. He gestured lightly to the papers between them. Clara listened without interrupting, her gaze steady. And, she asked. Ethan paused, not because he did not know the answer, but because this time, the answer was not just his to decide. I will not do it without you, he said finally, the words simple, but carrying everything he had learned since the night he stood at her door. Clara held his gaze for a long moment, searching not for ambition, not for persuasion, but for truth, and when she found it, she looked down briefly, then back up, her expression softer now, more open than it had ever been. Then do not, she replied, her voice quiet, but certain. The words settled between them, not as a condition, but as a choice, one that neither of them tried to complicate. Ethan let out a slow breath, something in him finally stilling in a way it never had before, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, because nothing needed to be added. He stood after a second, moving around the table, not out of urgency, not out of impulse, but because the distance between them no longer made sense. Clara remained where she was, watching him approach, her expression calm, but there was something in her eyes now, something unguarded, something that had been building quietly through every shared moment. Every conversation, every silence. He stopped in front of her, close enough that the space between them felt intentional, not accidental. Can I stay? He asked, the same question, but no longer about a place, no longer about circumstance, but about something deeper, something neither of them had planned but both had chosen. Clara looked up at him, a small smile forming, not dramatic, not overwhelming, just real, and she nodded once. "You never really left," she said softly. The city continued. Outside, unchanged, unaware, but inside that small apartment, two lives had shifted into something new, not defined by what had been lost or gained, but by what had been chosen when it mattered most. And in that quiet, steady moment, Ethan Caldwell understood something he had never learned in any boardroom. That power could build everything, but it was dignity, and the person who saw it in you when you had nothing, that made you stay. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and let us know where you are watching from, and please subscribe to When He Chose Her channel for more powerful stories about dignity, quiet strength, and unexpected love. Your support helps us keep telling stories that truly matter.